Hello, I'm Barbara Levin, the Executive Director of Neurofibromatosis Mid-Atlantic. Welcome to Early Signs of Learning and Attention Vulnerability in NF-1, presented today by Dr. Bonnie Klein-Tasman of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I want to thank you so much for joining us for this very exciting and informative program. We are joined today by people from throughout the world. We're very happy to be sponsoring this educational event. Because we have some folks joining us today who are hearing impaired, I've written down my opening and closing remarks. We will provide a closed caption version as soon as possible. NF Mid-Atlantic is a nonprofit organization based in Baltimore. We've been around for 34 years, and we remain committed to our founding principles of supporting people with NF, their families, their caregivers, their circles, and anyone who has an interest in NF by providing awareness, support, and education. There is a few housekeeping items. There's a question pane on the right side of your screen. If you have questions during the presentation, simply type in your question and click send. At the end of the presentation, we will do a Q&A session and take as many questions as time permits. I will be muting everyone while Dr. Klein-Tasman speaks, but feel free to write your questions. This broadcast is being recorded and will be available on the NF Mid-Atlantic website at www.nfmidatlantic.org by April 4th, 2013. It will also be available on our YouTube channel, NF Mid-Atlantic. You can view all our archived webinars at our website and YouTube channel. To be informed of release, please subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook, or at our Twitter stream at NF Mid-Atlantic. We're so honored to welcome Dr. Klein-Tasman. She has been studying the cognitive and attention difficulties in young children with NF-1. Her study, which was sponsored in part by NF Mid-Atlantic, has yielded comprehensive descriptive information about the areas in which young children with NF-1 may show difficulties in comparison to the general population. Early identification of difficulties can set the stage for interventions and supports to maximize functioning. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that NF Mid-Atlantic survives solely on your donations. If you appreciate this educational webinar and you want them to remain free, please consider a donation in any amount. You may do so at www.nfmidatlantic.org. We're a tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we've made donating very easy. Also, please join us on April 25th, 2013 at 11 a.m. for the top 10 tips for success in the special education process. You can sign up for this webinar at our website. Please indulge us for a moment while I turn this webinar over to Dr. Klein-Tasman. Thank you again. We are all set, Dr. Klein-Tasman.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bonnie Klein-Tasman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I, among other things, study the development of children with neurofibromatosis. And I am going to be talking about early signs of attention and vulnerability in neurofibromatosis, which is some research that I have been working on for the past number of years. All right, there we go. Okay, so the collaborators on this research include physicians at the Children's Hospital of Wisconsin and psychologists Scott Hunter and physician Jim Tonsgard of the University of Chicago. And as Barbara mentioned, this work was supported in part by NF Mid-Atlantic. It has also received support from NF Midwest, from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Research Growth Initiative, which got the work started, from the University of Chicago CTSA, and from a band that collected donations called Dorf Kapell. And in this talk, you are going to hear about the varieties of abilities that are measured when we look at cognitive and psychosocial functioning in young children. You're going to hear a little bit and learn a little bit about how these kinds of abilities can be measured, because I do know that lots of people think that in young kids it's challenging to do this work, and it is, but it can be done. And you're going to hear about findings from research about cognitive and psychosocial functioning in children with NF, and this work is work that's been going on for the last number of years in my lab. So first I want to start by reviewing what we know about cognitive and psychosocial difficulties in people with neurofibromatosis. So what we know is that overall intellectual functioning tends to be a little bit lower than that of unaffected siblings. There's an increased rate of language problems, an increased rate of visual perceptual problems, and an increased rate of visual motor difficulties. We also know that psychosocial functioning can be affected, and psychosocial functioning has to do with kind of everyday functioning. And there's an increased rate of attention problems and social problems. And in general, we know that there is an increased rate of learning problems and learning disabilities in individuals with neurofibromatosis. But what I really want to emphasize is that in all of these areas, there's a very high level of variability and not really a consistent pattern. So people who study genetic conditions of different kinds sometimes find that there's a very clear pattern of strengths and weaknesses that is characteristic of kids with a particular syndrome or a particular genetic abnormality. That's not the case in neurofibromatosis. There is a lot of variability both in the level of functioning and in the pattern of functioning. And most individuals with neurofibromatosis, the literature suggests, do not have intellectual impairments or significant psychosocial difficulties. But close to half do have some difficulties, and that's what we're trying to get a better understanding of is, okay, well, what do those difficulties look like when the kids are younger? The other piece is that the pattern is not consistent. So some kids have language difficulties, some kids have visual motor difficulties, some kids have attention problems, and they don't always travel together completely. So what I'm doing in my work is focusing on young kids, and the reason I do that is because much of the research is about cognitive characteristics in school-age children, adolescents, and adults. And we know that physically neurofibromatosis is a progressive condition. And one of the things that I think may be the case is that we may be able to see some difficulties in early childhood that could serve as indicators of later learning difficulties. We know that there are medically based interventions that are being developed to try to address symptoms of neurofibromatosis. And we need to know a little bit more about how early we can identify these difficulties so that we know who needs these interventions and who might develop just fine without these interventions. So to do that, I began the UWM neurofibromatosis developmental study about 4 or 5 years ago, focusing on cognitive and psychosocial functioning of young children with neurofibromatosis. And it starts with a cross-sectional piece, so meaning a one-time snapshot of kids starting between ages of 3 and 6, with a few 7- and 8-year-olds in there from the beginning of the study. And what we're trying to look at are patterns of psychosocial and cognitive abilities, and relations among abilities that might tell us a little bit about vulnerability. Another component of this study is a longitudinal component, and what that means is that the 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds who are enrolled in the study have been followed year after year, some of them for as many as 4 years and some of them for closer to 2. And this piece of the study is ongoing. And the goal of this piece of the study is to see if we can see early indicators of later difficulties or protective indicators that indicate that kids are really on a good trajectory and may not need additional supports. And so that longitudinal piece will culminate in visits at 8, 9, or 10 years old to try and see, okay, well, what are things looking like at that point? And how do they relate to what we saw when the kids were 3, 4, 5, or 6? Across all of this work, what I try to do is use multiple measures and multiple informants. Any one measure provides just a snapshot, and any one reporter has their own things that they tend to pay attention to or their own situations that they tend to observe the child most frequently in. And what we want to see is what consistency looks like across measures and across multiple perspectives, because those pieces that are most consistent across multiple perspectives may be some of the things that we want to intervene with first. So in this study, I used parent report. I also used teacher report. And then I also rely on observational and lab-based measures to get a sense of functioning. I want to emphasize that all of the different areas that I look at in this study, because I try to take a very comprehensive whole person approach to this, are very interrelated. So you can see I have certain circles here overlapping with other circles here. But really, everything overlaps with everything, but you wouldn't be able to read the figure if I did it that way. The goal of this figure is really to mention that all of the abilities that we're talking about are interrelated. Attention affects learning, motor functioning can affect temperament, and so on and so forth. So some cautions. In this research, my focus is really on picking up even mild difficulties that might indicate vulnerability. So I'm looking for evidence for difficulties, not necessarily areas where there's a clear deficit or impairment in these young kids. The second piece is that psychological tests, especially in early childhood, get a snapshot of current functioning and are not highly stable. So things can really change over time. And additionally, there's a lot of developmental variability in the early childhood years. So what is considered typical in a 3-year-old can vary very, very widely. And so that is part of what makes this work challenging to do and makes interpretation that we have to be very careful about how we interpret the data. So one of the things that I rely quite a bit on are measures that yield what are called standard scores. And so I want to talk a little bit about what it is that a standard score is and how we interpret them. So what we do is we provide the child with a task, and we tally up the number of questions that they answer correctly. And then we take into account the difficulty of the questions that were given. And then we compare that score to that of other children the same age. And that gives us what's called a standard score. And that tells us how similar the level of ability is to other children the child's age. Generally speaking, for example, for intellectual functioning, average intellectual functioning would be considered to be 100. You can see in this bell curve that most individuals are going to fall near that central midpoint, near 100. And as you move farther and farther away, there are going to be fewer and fewer children who are showing abilities that are at that level. So this is what standard scores are. So now I want to describe a little bit about the participants in this study. We have a few more participants than this now, but generally speaking, we've got about 60 kids with neurofibromatosis between the ages of 3 and 8, with the majority of those between 3 and 6. And then 55 kids who are unaffected. And these unaffected kids are either siblings of the kids with neurofibromatosis or they're members of the community near UWM and in Milwaukee more generally, to provide a sense of, well, what does development look like when we're looking at kids who do not have neurofibromatosis? So I'm going to start by talking about some findings that we have related to early cognitive functioning. And this schematic gives you a sense of how we measure early cognitive functioning. So at the bottom, you see particular areas. So we might ask kids to copy drawings or to put together patterns with blocks or to notice which pictures have similar things in them, or to name pictures or to follow instructions. And those abilities fall into 3 domains: verbal functioning, nonverbal reasoning functioning, and spatial functioning. And they combine together to yield what's called a general conceptual ability score, which is kind of like an IQ and reflects their overall thinking ability. So here is the first piece of data I'm going to show you, which indicates how many kids are showing behavior that in that area of cognitive functioning that's either average or above, and how many kids show behavior that is not falling in the solidly average range. And I should mention that 1 standard deviation below the mean really is not necessarily indicative of a clear impairment. Typically, we're looking at performance 2 standard deviations below the mean before we say we have impairment. But what we're talking about here is abilities that are less developed on average than kids their same age. And what we see is that cognitive difficulties defined in this way are seen in some young children with neurofibromatosis, but many children are not really showing any difficulties at all. significantly more children with neurofibromatosis showed performance below average than kids in our contrast group of siblings and community participants. And it's notable that even though, if you look here, you'll see that there are between 20% and 30% of kids showing difficulty in any one of these areas, close to half of the children with neurofibromatosis in this sample showed a difficulty in at least one area. Often mild difficulties, but a difficulty nonetheless. So on average, it's important to note that young children with neurofibromatosis have cognitive abilities that are in the average range. Now in older kids, what has been noticed is a downward shift in intellectual functioning. So overall intellectual functioning is in the average range, but it's a little bit lower on average than is seen in the general population. And we're seeing the same thing in these young children. We're also seeing that close to half show a cognitive difficulty in at least one domain. But it's important to note that most young children with neurofibromatosis do not show difficulty, and certainly most young children don't show any deficits in any of the areas. But some do, and more do than in the general population. And there's a wide range of difficulties across kids. Some have verbal difficulties, some have nonverbal, some have spatial. And there's also some indication from these data that early motor planning difficulties are especially common. But there isn't really a very specific pattern of strength and weakness. So next, that's a lab-based measure where we have the child do a bunch of different tasks. And I always feel like it's important to get a sense of, well, what's happening in the world outside of the lab? And so measures of adaptive functioning are one way of getting a sense of everyday functioning from the perspective of parents. And this study was Alina Colon's undergraduate research. And she took a look at how kids were doing on the scales of independent behavior, which is a parent report measure of everyday functioning in the areas of social interaction, personal living, community living, and motor skills. And what she found generally was that children with neurofibromatosis had some everyday adaptive skills difficulties. In lots of different areas, they showed abilities that were somewhat weaker than other kids their age. She found that adaptive skills were really closely related to intellectual functioning and that they were really very, very tied together. But one of the things that we did is take a look at just children with neurofibromatosis who have cognitive functioning that is in the average range. So just kids who don't have cognitive functioning that that is at all delayed. And we saw that those kids had poorer motor functioning than we would expect in comparison to the contrast group. Now, it's important to mention that that motor functioning was still solidly in the average range, but it was weaker than we saw in the community group. So one of the things that we want to know is if this early variability in motor functioning relates to later learning problems, and that's something that we'll have to study in the future. So the next piece I want to talk to you about is one of my student, Kelly Yankee's dissertation project. And what she did is took a look at pre-academic skills. So even though 3 to 6-year-olds certainly are not doing math or reading, they are doing some kinds of tasks that are underpinnings of later math and reading abilities. And these include an early number concepts task, a phonological processing task. Phonological processing is an underpinning of reading abilities, and it involves being able to be aware of how words are made up of component sounds. So like the word cat is made up of k, act, those kinds of things. And that's a very important building block for reading. And then rapid naming, which is very quickly being able to name objects, which has also been associated with reading abilities. And what she found is that when she examined differences between children with neurofibromatosis and unaffected kids, she saw that while performance was still on average in the average range, kids with neurofibromatosis tended to have more difficulty with the early number concepts and more difficulty with the phonological processing than did the community controls. And she found that there was a greater percentage of children with neurofibromatosis who had difficulty on these tasks than the contrast group. So in general, what we saw is that 30% of children with neurofibromatosis had difficulty with either pre-reading skills or early math skills. That in general it was weaker than the contrast group, And it was also very closely tied to intellectual functioning. So those kids who had greater difficulty on the overall measure of intellectual functioning also were the kids who had greater difficulty with these pre-academic skills. But even when you take into account overall level of functioning, we saw some relations between these various pre-academic skills and some conceptual skills. So pre-reading skills were related to how quickly children could process information, to their memory abilities, and to their receptive language skills. And early math skills were related both to nonverbal reasoning skills and to receptive language abilities. And we might expect that related to the receptive language abilities because so much of the way that kids are learning math concepts in these early years is really mediated through language. So another area that we took a look at has to do with emerging executive functioning. And executive functioning has to do with this idea of being able to manage your own behavior and your attention and to allocate it in particular ways that fit the situation. So your ability to stop yourself from doing things that you're not supposed to do when you're not supposed to do them, to manage your emotions, to stay with tasks when they're challenging or when they require focus, to shift from one task to another, and then to plan and organize your behavior. And this work, I was working with Michael Schuett, an undergraduate student, to take a look at these data. And what we found on this measure is that in general, kids with neurofibromatosis were not showing a lot of difficulties, young children. Were not showing a lot of difficulties on these measures quite yet. But there was one scale, the working memory scale that you see in the middle, where kids with neurofibromatosis had the most difficulty. And what we saw there is that based on both parent and teacher report, the kids with neurofibromatosis had greater difficulties on this measure than did the kids in the community sample. And we also saw that parents and teachers tended to agree about which kids were the ones who had these difficulties with working memory. And the way working memory is defined here is not in terms of the performance on a particular lab-based task, but instead is based on parent and teacher ratings of how easily the child can stay with tasks and work with tasks and continue to pay attention to them. So in some ways, it's like an attention task. So then we looked at, well, how many kids are having difficulties with this? And the first thing I want you to notice is that if you look at the unaffected kids parent reports, so the TD parent, there are a lot of kids who are 3 to 6 years old who have difficulties with working memory. So close to 25% of kids generally have some difficulties with working memory. Keeping in mind what I said at the beginning about us looking not for deficits here, but looking for areas of vulnerability. But nevertheless, what we can see is that based on parent and on teacher report, twice as many kids with neurofibromatosis are showing those difficulties. And so that's a piece of the puzzle that's important to be paying attention to. And this enters into that overall emergent metacognition index, which has to do with overall how good is the child at managing their own thoughts and behavior. Another place where we saw some mild areas of potential difficulty were in the area of emotional control, where we still see that about 14% of parents of unaffected kids show difficulty there, and it's closer to 30% in the kids with NF. So in 3 to 5-year-olds, which was the focus of this particular piece of the study, we see very few areas that are really significant areas of difficulty based either on parent report or teacher report. We do see that children with NF have more difficulty on the working memory scale than do the unaffected kids, and close to 50% of young children with NF show these kinds of difficulties. And it's important to note that those difficulties are rather mild and that we do see this seems to be an area of vulnerability for kids generally. One of the things that is important is that both parents and teachers are seeing the behaviors. So the next thing that I wanted to focus on has to do with temperament. So temperament has to do with people's overall ways of interacting with the world. Does the person tend to be more extroverted or more introverted? Does the person tend to experience more sadness or fear or anger? And this work is done in collaboration with Dana Haberman, who's an undergraduate student in my lab who's working on her student thesis looking at temperament in kids with neurofibromatosis. And for this, I use the Children's Behavior Questionnaire that has these various scales and these areas that it's assessing. And one of the things I like about this measure is that it is meant to look at variability that is typical. So it's not looking at problem behavior necessarily. It's really looking at what is each individual child like. And she found some very interesting findings here. Firstly, she found that in young children, kids with NF don't really differ from unaffected kids in their range of negative affectivity. What she did find is that in the areas of extroversion and the areas of effortful control, kids with neurofibromatosis were more extroverted and exhibited significantly lower levels of effortful control than unaffected kids. And what that means is that what we're picking up on are the attention difficulties and difficulties with inhibition that are discussed in the literature about older kids with neurofibromatosis. These also do seem to be present to some degree in younger kids with neurofibromatosis. And this is true even when we take into account the fact that the kids with neurofibromatosis are on average showing intellectual functioning that's a little bit lower than the unaffected kids. So in general, what we found is that anger, fear, sadness, discomfort, about the same level as unaffected children. More extroversion, more activity level, higher activity level, more impulsivity in the kids with NF than in the unaffected kids. But it's also important to note that it's not as if they're showing very, very high levels of activity or impulsivity. It's just that on average it's a little higher than the contrast group. Similarly, kids with NF have lower effortful control than the unaffected kids. They're showing lower attentional focus, lower inhibitory control. And yes, these things are closely tied with intellectual functioning, but many of the group differences are even there once we take into account intellectual functioning. So now I want to move to looking at attention problems in a more problem-oriented way rather than as a look at kind of variability in attention problems generally that we see in the general population that we do with the temperament measure. So this is a measure of attention problems that is more clinical in basis, looking at oppositionality, inattention, hyperactivity, and overall attention problems. And this is looking at parent report and how kids are rated by their parents in terms of these areas. And what you can see is that even in these young kids, we are picking up on about 1/3 of kids with neurofibromatosis who, based on parent ratings of attention problems, are falling in the at-risk or clinical range based on the ADHD index. We're also seeing that inattention is more commonly seen, somewhat more commonly seen than hyperactivity is, which is also consistent with the literature on older kids. But I do want you to notice that some level of hyperactivity does seem to be present for some kids with neurofibromatosis as well. So one of the questions I always have when I'm looking at these kinds of data from parents is that parents have different levels of experience with young kids and therefore may have different expectations regarding their young kids. And so it's helpful for us to be able to see relations between parent report and teacher report, like you saw before for that emerging executive functioning piece, but also for more general attention problems to take a look at relations between parent report and what we're seeing in the lab. And so we have some preliminary data taking a look at relations of observational measures to parent report. So what we do for these observational measures is we take a look at kids' turn-taking and patience abilities. So what we do is we have them build a tower with us. I take a turn and then you take a turn and then I take a turn and then you take a turn. And sometimes I take a very long time to take my turn. I wait 10 seconds or I wait 15 seconds or I wait 20 seconds, and it's a very long time. And what we do is we see what do children do in that situation. Do they go ahead and take their turn? Do they try and get us to take our turn in some way? Do they wait patiently? And in this case, what we see is that performance on this measure, and in particular, the tendency to physically place a block in the partner's hand and ask them to put it in there physically, is related to inattention and to attention problems, which suggests that parents are picking up on something that we can see in the lab. So I've covered a lot of ground today. I've talked about a lot of different areas, but what I want to do now is summarize what it is that I think we're seeing in this study of young children with neurofibromatosis. So one thing is that we are seeing differences from unaffected kids for overall cognitive functioning, for adaptive functioning, for some areas of emerging executive functioning, and in terms of temperament variables that are related to attention. We're seeing agreement across measurement approaches. So we're seeing agreement across parents and teachers. We're seeing agreement when we take a look at what's happening on a measure of normative variability, like that temperament measure, in comparison to a measure of problem behavior, like that attention problems measure. And we're also seeing agreement across observational and more questionnaire-based measures, which suggests that what we're seeing is something that's pretty robust. Generally, we're finding very mild difficulties with cognitive functioning or pre-academic functioning for 1/3 to about a half of young children with neurofibromatosis. And it's important to note that at least half are really not showing difficulties. So how do we place this in the context of what we understand about neurofibromatosis in general? Well, the first thing is that we know that neurofibromatosis results from a gene mutation on chromosome 17. And we also know that when we look at the brains of individuals with neurofibromatosis, we see some subcortical differences in their brains that are referred to as UBOs. And we also see some white matter abnormalities on average when we look at the brains of individuals with neurofibromatosis. And what Payne and Karmeloff-Smith and Uden have suggested is that these vulnerabilities lead to a kind of less efficient brain, and that leads to motor, attention, and learning problems. And what the current study that I've reported to you has demonstrated is that in some young children we do indeed see those difficulties. And we see some motor planning difficulties, we see some difficulties staying with tasks, and we see some pre-academic difficulties that can be picked up even in those early years. But there's a very, very important big question here. This, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're taking a look at a snapshot of abilities at 3, 4, 5, and 6. And young children show a very big range of abilities, and they also show fits and starts in their development at various points in time. So there's a lot of variability in developmental patterns. And so one of the things that we need to find out is whether these early patterns that we're seeing translate into later difficulties. And in order to do that, we really need to follow development in the same children over time. We need to do that longitudinal piece of the research. Now, I know that some of you are tuning in because you're eager to try and figure out, okay, well, what are early signs of learning and attention vulnerability? And also, what can you do to support the development of abilities in young kids? And so these last couple of slides are really focusing on supporting development and what kinds of things, from a practical standpoint, can you do at home to support the development of your child, given that we do sometimes see these difficulties in young children with neurofibromatosis. And the rate of these difficulties in young children with neurofibromatosis is certainly higher than in the general population. So first, in the area of motor functioning, practice drawing, make it fun, do some puzzles. And if you're seeing difficulties, definitely seek an occupational therapy evaluation to take a look at motor planning and fine motor abilities. In terms of attention and focus, even with young kids, it's important to build up the ability to spend time at a table doing a task. This is very important for being able to function effectively in a kindergarten classroom and certainly in a first grade classroom. And some kids find this very difficult to do. And it's best generally when working at that table to alternate between tasks the child enjoys and tasks that are maybe of less interest or are more challenging. And then start with just a little bit of time, 2 or 3 minutes, and gradually lengthen the amount of time spent on less preferred tasks. Make sure there aren't too many distractions around, help out with the task, and engage with your child so that they find this process reinforcing. In terms of supporting pre-reading abilities, reading is the best thing that you can do for your child to support those abilities. And especially focusing on rhyming books. Like Dr. Seuss books are fantastic. Rhyming books, books with repeated words, repeating endings of words, repeated beginnings of words, those help really shape those phonics skills. Practice phonics, sing rhyming songs together, make up rhyming songs together. Point out how different words sound the same or different. And if you're seeing language difficulties, seek out a speech therapy evaluation. In terms of pre-math abilities, count. Count things all over the place. When you're walking, count your steps. When they're putting things in a bag, count how many there are. Some recent research is suggesting that counting past 10 in young kids is particularly important and particularly predictive of later functioning. Many of us think, oh, we got to stop at 10. Even with young kids, keep going. Go up to 20, go up to 30. Make counting a part of your routine. And talk about quantities, more, less, full, empty, about these differences between objects that we can see. Is this one more full or less full? Those kinds of things. That will help support some of those math abilities. So I want to end by thanking various people who have played a role in this work. I want to first and foremost thank the families of the children with NF-1 who have come to the lab year after year to participate in our research and have filled out hours and hours of questionnaires. And we're really grateful to them. I'm also very, very grateful for the support that we've received from a number of different sources to get this work off the ground. And then I mentioned a few students whose work I have included here, but there really is a large range of students who've been involved in this work, and so I'm very grateful to all of them. And then I'm very grateful for genetic counselors at both the University of Chicago and Children's Hospital of Wisconsin who really connect families with this study and encourage them to be involved in it. And I find this work would not be able to be done without their help. And now I'm ready for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Klein-Tasman. I, for one, was riveted, and we have a number of questions. I hope you can hear me.
Absolutely.
And the first one comes to us, it came to us early on, and you may have answered it, but it bears repeating. As close to the half of children with NF-1 do have these problems, someone wanted to know, how were your subjects identified? Did they come to you through NF clinics, or was the NF discovered after the fact?
That's a really good question. These families came to me through NF clinics. So there's a clinic at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, and there's a clinic at the University of Chicago, from which all of the families came from those two clinics. And it's important to note that the vast majority of the families were not seeking help at the clinic because of learning problems. So it wasn't a learning disabilities clinic, it was a medical management clinic. And it's one that sees kids very early on. They're often the people to be making the initial diagnosis.
Interesting. On the same vein, someone wanted to know, in practice, do teachers and caregivers understand these needs? I think they not only meant the attention vulnerability needs, but also the NF needs, and I don't know if you can answer that or not.
Right. It's in terms of the NF needs more generally, I think that it really varies. It depends on whether they've come into contact with individuals with neurofibromatosis before or not. But I think one of the big challenges is that because of the amount of variability that there is, knowing that a child has NF doesn't necessarily lead directly to a set of recommendations, because as we've seen, half of kids with neurofibromatosis really aren't having any problems and therefore don't need any additional supports. Half have some difficulties, but the range of difficulties is so broad that you really need to know what's happening with each individual child. So one major recommendation that I would have for parents of all kids with neurofibromatosis is that individual assessments, preferably pediatric neuropsychology assessments, are likely to be very important to include because you really do need to get an individual sense of the strengths and weaknesses for each individual child. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle.
Excellent. Thank you. Is there a distinction with parent observation between those parents who also have NF-1 and those who do not have NF-1? Interesting.
That's a really, really good question. We're still in the midst of analyzing those data, and so we don't have a definitive answer. What I can tell you is that we've done some exploratory work at that and haven't seen huge differences between ratings by parents who themselves have NF or who have family members with NF and those without, but it's really preliminary. We have to take a closer look at that.
Thank you. This next question may be better answered. It's possible that I can answer this better. Someone wants to know, is there a copy of this webinar going to be available? I help run a group of military families who have children with NF. I would love to share this with other military families that couldn't make it today. Well, firstly, I want you to know that we have a lot of military families. I want the audience to know we have a lot of military families where where someone in the military has NF or a child has NF, and yes, this will be available. I put it back up on our screen. This will, as quickly as I get this up, this is being recorded. It will be available in its entirety at www.nfmidatlantic.org by tomorrow at the latest, possibly by later this afternoon. We also have it on our YouTube channel, which is NF Mid-Atlantic. We currently have all our archived webinars, but this is a particularly salient one that you will want to see. There were so many facts in that I know I want to see it again. So thank you for the question and for your service. I have another question sent to us. How often, interesting question, how often have you seen children who are nonverbal with autistic behavior?
Okay. So we do see a few. One of the things that I think is really important to note is that there isn't anything about having neurofibromatosis that protects against other potential neurodevelopmental disorders. And at this point, the rate of autism spectrum disorders in the general population is very high. As you know, the most recent estimates were 1 in 50. Until then, we've been saying about 1 in 100. And so we would expect the same rate of autism in kids with NF as well. And so there are certainly some kids with neurofibromatosis who also have autism.
Thank you. We only have time for one more question, and I'm reserving it for myself. And I would like to know, Dr. Klein-Tasman, what are the next steps for this study? What are the next steps for you to get this out there, and how can we help?
Right.
That was 2 questions, sorry.
So next steps, as I mentioned during the talk, one of the things that I think we really, really do need to do is follow up with these families when their kids are more school-aged. So when their kids are in the age range where the vast majority of the literature has already been published demonstrating areas of difficulty, those school-age years. So we really do need to follow up with kids in that age range. And in order to do that, I will need to be doing some grant writing to get some additional funds to support that work. In the shorter term, what we're working on is trying to get the results that I have presented here and some other results written up and published in scientific peer-reviewed journals so that more people can hear about them and read about them and build on the work that's being done here in follow-up studies as well. So those are the 2 pieces. One is doing a lot of writing and following up with the families we've seen to see if we can see connections between early functioning and later functioning. And that second part we'll be looking for additional grant support to do that.
Thank you. Is it possible that we can follow up with you in a couple months and see how things are progressing?
I would love that. Absolutely. I think it's really critical to let families know about the work that's being done, and so I'm really grateful for this opportunity from NF Mid-Atlantic to present this work to families and individuals who are interested in the work. it's really a unique opportunity to do that, and I've been really appreciative of it. I'd love to follow up with you.
Well, we are thrilled, and to that effect, I'm sure you'll all agree we want to thank Dr. Klein-Tasman, Bonnie Klein-Tasman, for sharing this important information and entertaining. We also want to thank you for joining us. By April 4th, again by tomorrow, this session will be available for viewing in its entirety, and you can view the slides and audio two ways: the NF Mid-Atlantic website, www.nfmidatlantic.org, or at our YouTube channel, NF Mid-Atlantic. Before we close, I want to remind everyone that NF Mid-Atlantic survives solely on your donations. If you appreciated this webinar, and we know you did, and you want them to remain free, please consider a donation. You can do it at the same website, www.nfmidatlantic.org. Our next webinar is Top 10 Tips for Success in the Special Education Process. That's with Ellen Caligari, who is a well-known special ed attorney, and she will help you through the IEP process. That is to be held on April 25th, 2013 at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's important for anyone who has a child in need of special education. Again, you can sign up at our website, www.nfmidatlantic.org. Also, I will be sending around, I will follow this up in a couple days. Should anyone wish to contribute to Dr. Klein-Tasman's project, we will make sure you have information to do just that. I want to thank everyone again, and especially Dr. Bonnie Klein-Tasman. Thank you, and I am going to close off this webinar now. Thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.